Anyway, we are ready to get started. Principles and precepts of the Torah series, and I would want to clarify: Torah is not Talmud. Torah is actual scripture. It is the Hebrew word commonly translated law. It's translated law, but actually it means teaching. And even Christian commentaries, and I got a Bible by Thomas Nelson where they go into the Hebrew word for law, and they said it's unfortunate that the Hebrew word law was translated Torah was translated law. They felt that meant teaching, and that's very true. So anyway, we are back, and so we want to get started on this. We shared last week about the importance of eating clean, of being clean. Yahweh calls us to holiness. He calls us to cleanness. He calls us to uprightness, and we talked about last week why that's important, and and the importance of not defiling our bodies with meats of unclean animals and fish and rodents and so on, and we started to address some of the places where in the so-called New Testament people might use to try to justify eating pork and eating other unclean meats. And we spent some time on that, and we're going to continue to spend some time on that, mainly because, from what I've learned, sometimes it's easier to just learn something than it is to have to unlearn something else in order to learn it. So we are going to spend some time, and hopefully what I share will be something that will help you to unlearn error and learn something from the scriptures that maybe some of you have not noticed before or discerned. And I don't claim to have all knowledge. I don't claim to be all-knowing. Only thing I'm claiming is that I'm trying to follow Yahweh the best of my understanding, and hopefully I can share my notes, and you can compare my notes to yours, and between all of us together can come to a better understanding of what is truth as we test all things according to the word of Elohim. So our study title today in our Precepts and Principles of the Torah series is Cleaving to Yahweh's Standard of Clean and Unclean. You know, I've heard the saying in church circles, cleanliness is next to godliness. You know, they feel that, you need to be a person that is clean physically, keep yourself clean, keep yourself, looking presentable. And they feel that they go hand in hand. And by that, they might mean clean shaven, clean cut, clean shaven kind of person. And is that biblical? Or they might mean, you need to wear your suit and tie to church services. And, what does that mean? What does it mean? What is real, true cleanness in the eyes of our Father in heaven? Is it, you got your hands all dirty, you've been working out in the garden, you need to go wash your hands? And is that cleanness in His eyes? What is cleanness? What is dirtiness or uncleanness in the eyes of Yahweh? And so we want to look at this in our text that we are beginning our journey last week, and we're going to continue to, as we go through here, to expound upon, is Leviticus chapter 11, and verse 1 and verse 2. It says, "Now Yahweh spoke to Moshe and Aaron, saying to them, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, These are the animals which you may eat among all the animals on the earth." And He's going to give us a list, and I do want to go over it, but before we really go over it, I want to make sure that we understand why it matters. And unless we understand why it matters and what relevance it has to us, we may end up going through Leviticus 11 and going over it with a fine-tooth comb, so to speak, and nobody really cares, or there'll be a percentage of people that don't really care to go through it because they don't think it matters to them. So before I really get into this, I want to address a lot of these points that are brought up in churches today. You might come across in your studies, and so we can properly understand why it matters first. And one of the things they'll point out a lot of times is, they want to point out this particular point right here. Speak to who? Speak to the children of Israel. Aha. Well, if it's speaking to the children of Israel, and I don't happen to be Jewish, then does that apply to me? If I'm not an Israelite, if my dad is not Jewish or my mom is not Jewish, then does it matter? Some would say it doesn't matter because he's speaking to Israel. This is that old Levitical law that doesn't apply to us anymore. That old Levitical law that is for the Jews. And they prove it. Here it is. It says right here in the text, speak to who? Who's he talking to? He's talking to the children of Israel. So why would that matter to me, a New Testament Christian, as some would say? Well, the Levitical law. Did you know the commandment which says, love your neighbor as yourself, is a Levitical law? It's found in Leviticus chapter 19. That the commandment to refrain from, here's an example, refrain from incest is a Levitical law found in Leviticus 18, verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel. Same phrase. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, I'm Yahweh your Elohim. You go on down to verse 6, and he says, none of you shall approach anyone who is near of kin to him to uncover his nakedness. I am Yahweh. The nakedness of your father or nakedness of your mother you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. All right. Now, unless you believe incest is okay, and I certainly hope you don't, we understand, okay, yes, he's speaking to the children of Israel. But that is not a justifiable reason for people who are not children of Israel to ignore it. We see that a command here is given that they're not to commit this sin of incest, uncovering nakedness of their family members. And we know, even in the New Testament, Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 reprimands the Corinthians for a man who happened to be having his father's wife. Now, where in the New Testament does it say it's wrong for a man to have his father's wife? Nowhere, except for that place. Well, where did he get the idea? What about a man having his sister? Where is that forbidden in the New Testament? The only thing you can come up with is the phrase sexual immorality. Okay, well, what's sexual immorality? What is it? Can we find that defined anywhere in the New Testament? Not really. You have to go back to Torah. You have to go back to Yahweh's law, where Yahweh defines for us what sexual immorality really is and what sexual immorality really isn't. And so we can't just go by New Testament only theology. We can't just say, well, I don't follow anything in the Old Testament. I'm strictly a New Testament believer. No one actually does that. Really, no one really does. Otherwise, you could justify all kinds of wrong things. Bribery. Nowhere in the New Testament does it say you can't take a bribe. There's all kinds of things that you could do. Where in the New Testament does it say take 10% of your income and give it to your church? Oh, don't tell your pastor that that's not done. That's done away with. That's Old Testament, because they will appeal to the Old Testament when it's convenient, when they feel it's necessary, and so it's not really consistent to say, well, I only get my doctrines from the New Testament. And so when we see this, we can't on the basis of the phrase "speak to the children of Israel" preceding a list of commandments conclude by that alone the commandment was only intended for Israel. Because the truth is, the commandments, while they were given to Israel and while the Jews were given the oracles of Elohim, Yahweh desired that the Jewish people would be a light to all nations. Now, you notice here in this diagram, this map, a tiny little country called Israel over here. And it's situated in such a way that anybody in the continent of Africa who wants to trade with anybody else in the Middle East, in Asia, they want to trade with anybody in Africa, an entire continent of nations. Where do they have to go through? They have to go through Israel. How about Europe? If they want to trade with anybody in Africa, they got to go through Israel. If the people of Southern Europe are going to pass through to trade with anybody out in this region, they're going to at least come near or go through Israel. And so Yahweh put Israel in such a location that it would get a lot of foot traffic passing through there. And so Yahweh desired that Israel would serve him, and that all these other nations, as they pass through, would hear about Yahweh's laws. They would hear about Yahweh being the Elohim, the mighty one of all the earth. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 5, it says, "Surely I have taught you statutes and judgments, just as Yahweh my Elohim commanded me, that you should act according to them in the land which you go to possess. Therefore be careful to observe them, for this is your wisdom." What is your wisdom? The statutes and judgments. This is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, as the nations around them, who will hear all these statutes and say, "Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people." And so the law of Yahweh was not only for Israel. It was for, yes, it was given to Israel, but to the extent and the intent that other nations, other peoples surrounding the nation of Israel would hear the words of Yahweh, and that they would turn their hearts to the Elohim of all the earth. That was Yahweh's desire. That's his intent. And so it's an error to assume that the law of Yahweh was only intended for the Jews. And that's not the only reason it's an error to assume that. In Romans 3:19 it says, "Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law." Okay? "That every mouth may be stopped, and all the world," that means everybody, the entire planet, "may become guilty before Elohim." Now, If all the world is guilty before Elohim because of what the law says, what does that tell us? If the law was only intended for the Jewish people, then the rest of the world would be free to disobey Yahweh's law. It would have no power to stop every mouth. It would have no power to make all the world become guilty. Why? Because it's not meant for the Gentiles. And so the reality is that the entire world is under the law if they don't have Messiah in their life. Without the Messiah, we are under the law's power to condemn us and to make us guilty before Elohim. If you don't believe that, then you don't have any reason to come to Yahshua to begin with. And so just that alone tells us the law of Yahweh was not only for the Jewish people. If it was only for the Jewish people, Gentiles would not have any need for the Messiah. They wouldn't be guilty for having broken anything because there's no law given to them. And so it's a mistake, and it's not true that the law of Yahweh is only for the Jewish people. Just that one verse alone, there's a ton of other verses. I've done a whole study on who the law is for. Is it for the Jews only? But this is just one of many places that clearly demonstrate that Yahweh, when he gave his law, yes, it was given to the Jewish people, but it was meant for everybody, not just the Jewish people. And so we go back here and we look at this, and just because it's saying Yahweh spoke to Moshe and to Aaron, and just because it's saying speak to the children of Israel, saying these are the animals which you may eat among the animals that are on the earth, just because he's prefacing it, this is Yahweh speaking to Moshe. Moshe was going to communicate it to the children of Israel. The sons of Israel. Sons of Israel will communicate it to their family members. And the family members, as they lived and they applied Yahweh's law, would be a light to the nations that were around them. And the nations around them would learn these animals were not created by Yahweh to be eaten by men. And so, otherwise, that law really isn't a wise and understanding thing. It really isn't their wisdom. And the nations around them aren't going to look, they're going to be parts of the law that the nations around them are going to see, oh, well, they're keeping this clean and unclean. Well, that's not wisdom. That's not good. That's not the way it was. It wasn't that way at all. The clean and the unclean laws was a major component of Yahweh's law. And it was for the Gentile to learn. And for them to look at them and say, yeah, this is a wise and understanding people. And so there's really the reality is there's really only one reason why most people today have this mentality that the clean and unclean laws are just for the Jews. The reason for that is simply due to the fact that the Jews happen to believe in observing these laws, while most people in Christianity do not. That's the only reason why people really assume it's for the Jews. But we can't go by what most Christians do as being the basis for which we do anything. I mean, truth is not decided by popular vote, is it? I mean, do we just take a poll to find out what the truth is? We can't do that. Truth is decided by what Yahweh says. Yahshua said in John 17:17, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. And so the question is okay, how many people are doing this? The question is, what does the word say? What does the light to all nations say? What does Yahweh's wisdom say? The law is Yahweh's wisdom. That's the question. Did he withdraw his commandments? Did he mark his commandments null and void? Even though this particular commandment, he said, you shall therefore distinguish between clean animals and unclean, between the unclean birds and the clean, and you shall not make yourselves abominable by beast or bird, by any living thing that creeps on the ground, which I separated from you as unclean. He says that they would make themselves abominable. I shared this last week. So for us to believe the mainstream theology that the clean and unclean laws regarding what we eat and what we don't eat, if we were to regard them as null and void, we have Yahweh saying, you make yourself totally detestable and abhorrent and gross and disgusting to me when you eat these things. 1 second. And then the minute Messiah dies on the tree, all of a sudden, oh, that's wonderful. It's not disgusting. It's clean. It's beautiful. It doesn't make any sense. There is no other commandment in Scripture where Yahweh changes his mind about what's an abomination and what's not an abomination. And so to think that he would do that would be to say he's not really the same yesterday, today, and forever. But I think he is. And so he's not going to make something detestable and abhorrent 1 minute and then say, oh, yeah, do what you want. Go ahead, bring it into the temple. Bring it into the temple of Yahweh right here. All those unclean meats and unclean things I find detestable. And so we're going to go over some of these scriptures, though, that people would use to justify this position. Now, if you never believed that the clean and unclean laws were done away with, when you read these verses in the New Testament, you wouldn't be thinking that, oh, well, we can eat what we want now. We would be looking elsewhere. And that's exactly what happened with the people who heard Yahshua's statements. Well, he can't be talking about it's okay to eat pork now. And he wasn't. And one of those places here, Luke chapter 11, says, as he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him. So he went in and sat down to eat. And when the Pharisee saw it, he marveled that he had not first washed before dinner. Then the master said to him, now you Pharisees make the outside of the cup and the dish clean, but your inward part is full of greed and wickedness. Boy, he laid it on the line to the Pharisee. Here he is eating dinner at the Pharisee's house. He's saying, you Pharisees make the outside of the cup all nice and clean, but then the inside is full of greed. It's full of greed. It's full of wickedness. Foolish ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But rather give alms of such things as you have, then indeed all things are clean to you. Now, if we're looking at this verse as a pork-eating Western Gentile, we might draw the conclusion. Yahshua is saying we can eat all the unclean meats we want as long as we give alms of what we have. For if indeed all things are clean to you, then a pork chop is no longer unclean. But this verse has nothing to do with clean and unclean meats. Notice verse 38. What's happening here? The issue, like the context we examined last week, has to do with whether or not we must wash our hands before we eat dinner. See, the people of that day felt that they must engage in a ritual washing prior to eating food in order for that food to be clean. This is not a commandment anywhere in Scripture. As we covered last week, Mark 7, it says, for the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way. They'll just wash their hands. It's got to be done in a particular way, up to a certain joint of the hand, depending on whether it's eating a normal meal or eating a sacrifice. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other things which they have received and hold, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" They didn't like that. They didn't like the idea of their traditions not being followed. Well, you got to understand that traditions of men were something that Yahshua was totally unimpressed with. The Pharisees were so self-focused that they felt like they needed to add a pile of man-made laws and traditions that had no basis in Scripture whatsoever. And the people of Yahshua's day were not making the proper distinction between the clean and the unclean. Yahweh told the people in Ezekiel, he says, "Your priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and the unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the clean and the unclean. And they've hidden their eyes from my Sabbath, so I'm profaned among them." Yahweh is very concerned that we understand the real difference between the clean and the unclean, the holy and the unholy. And there are two ways that we can misunderstand the difference between the clean and the unclean. There are two ways of rejecting the standard Yahweh gives us in His Word. The first way is failing to make a distinction at all, not even regard anything as being clean or unclean. And that's what we see today. And the second way of rejecting His standard is by creating our own standard of what's clean and what's unclean. So, and problem number one is what we have today. Problem number two was the problem in the first century. Why can't we just go back to what Yahweh's Word says? Why do we have to develop our own standards or throw out His standards? You see, Yahshua, He rejected their standards. He made a point to reject their standards. And when they asked Him why He wasn't adhering to their standards of what's clean and unclean, He used that as a springboard to rebuke them for adding to the word of Yahweh. The Pharisees and scribes asked, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders? They eat bread with unwashed hands." And He says, "Well, did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites? As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." All their worship, all their piety, their prayers, the things that they were doing was all in vain, because they were teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. He said, "For laying aside the commandment of Elohim, you hold the tradition of men, the washing of pitchers and cups and many other such things you do." So they were laying aside Yahweh's standard of what's clean and unclean, and they were doing their own. You got to wash the pitchers, you got to wash the cups, you got to wash your hands, you got to do this, you got to do that. Laying aside the commandment of Elohim. Now they went above and beyond the commandment of Elohim. They did not eat pork. All they did was to go above and beyond. And their idea was, this is how they believed, that they would build a fence around Yahweh's law. They build this little fence. Here's the standard. Okay, we're going to go a step further than what the law says. That way, if we break this standard, at least we wouldn't have broken the law itself. That was their mentality. Almost seems like an admirable attempt to keep people from breaking Yahweh's law. But there's a major problem with that. You become one who rejects and lays aside the commandment of Elohim by adding to it. He said to them, although all too well you reject the commandment of Elohim, that you may keep your tradition. So all we have to do in order for us to reject his word is add to it. That's all. Deuteronomy 4 verse 2 says, Now, O Israel, listen to the statutes and judgments which I teach you to observe, that you may live and go in and possess the land which Yahweh Elohim of your fathers is giving you. You shall not add to the word which I command you. You shall not add. Nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your Elohim, which I command you. If you are either adding to or you are taking away, either way, you are not keeping the commandments of Yahweh. You might think you are, but if you're adding to it, you're not keeping them. If you take away from it, obviously, you're not keeping them. And so what we have here, first century Judaism adding to 20th century Christianity taking away. That's what we have. What we need is we need to keep the commandments of Yahweh or Elohim and neither add to nor take away. Because if we add to, like they were doing, then we become liars. The one called Rabbi Akiba, who was the one responsible for the Jewish revolt, he was so committed to this false standard of what's clean and the unclean that when he was imprisoned and he was only given enough water just to drink from to survive, he wouldn't eat the food without washing his hands. And he used the water to wash his hands so he could eat. And he said he would rather have died than to eat with unwashed hands. That's how committed they were to the traditions of men. And here it is in the Babylonian Talmud. It says they wash hands for common food, but for the tithe, for the first offering, and for the wet which is holy, they dip them. And for the sin offering, and this is the principle here, they say, for if the hands are defiled, the body is defiled. That was their belief. Now, is that anywhere found in the scriptures? Does it ever say, if your hands are dirty, you haven't washed them, then the food's unclean? Does it ever say that? Nowhere. They are adding to, and by that, they were laying aside the commandment of Elohim. And so they were holding themselves to a standard of clean and unclean that is nowhere found in Yahweh's word. And because of these things, Yahweh said in Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13, as much as these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men. Now, what's the problem of letting our fear toward Yahweh be taught by the commandment of men? What's the problem with that? Well, there's a lot of problems with that. If our fear toward Yahweh is taught by the commandments of Yahweh, then whose word is going to be our meditation? Whose word are we going to study? Whose words are we going to delight in? Whose words are going to be the focus? It's going to be Yahweh's words. But if our fear toward Yahweh is taught by the commandments of men, then man's word becomes our focus. Man's word becomes our study sources. Man's word becomes what we delight in. And thus man puts himself in a position that should only belong to Yahweh alone. Man set himself up in the position of Elohim so that everyone would look to and cling to and seek the approval of their fellow men. That's the problem. And once the words of man become the focal point, Satan can get his words in there and lead the masses astray. Now, this is an age-old problem. I could literally spend several weeks expounding on the different ways this happens. King Saul, when he was defeating the Amalekites, he was caught up in seeking the approval of men, and because of that, he was rejected as being king. He rejected Yahweh's word that he might keep the commandments of men who had said, well, save some of this for Yahweh to offer as a sacrifice. You read that 1 Samuel 15. King Jeroboam, who was appointed to be a leader of the northern tribes of Israel, he set up a completely different set of a completely alternative worship system. So the northern tribes of Israel would follow feasts of the 8th month rather than the 7th, and different things. And the whole reason was so that he would get the attention rather than Yahweh getting the attention down in Judah. He was afraid that the people of the northern tribes would go down and worship Yahweh in Jerusalem and therefore be affected by the king down there, and then come back and say, we don't want you to be our king. We want the king of Judah to be our king. And by that, he would lose his position of power and wealth and status. And we have the same problem happening in the first century. The people did not, the Pharisees and scribes did not want the people, some of them, did not want the people to pay attention to the words of Yahweh. They wanted them to pay attention to their words, to the traditions of men, to the Talmudic ideas. I mean, the Talmud is simply a collection of opinions that are the Mishnah that the Jews had in the first century. And the Jewish people today, I'm sorry to say, are still following those men from the first century, those very men who rejected the Messiah, those very men who added to the words of Elohim. They study the words of those men. When you go to yeshiva, yeah, you think you're there to learn Torah, but what you're really there ultimately to learn is Talmud. And it's the words and opinions and doctrines and ideas of men. And same thing in Christianity. You go to a seminary. You go to seminary, you think you're there to learn the word. What you're really there to learn, in a lot of cases, is the doctrines of whatever church that happens to be running the seminary. And so the place becomes, the wordplay. Instead of a seminary, it becomes a cemetery. Because you're learning the words of that don't bring life. It's just dead words, dead doctrines. And you learn the theological positions of historical Christianity, all under the assumption that those things are correct. And so we have a consistent pattern throughout history of man setting up his own words, his own traditions, his own ideas as being superior to Elohim, and just by doing that, they're laying aside the commandments of Yahweh. And we had the same problem in the first century, people laying aside Yahweh's standard for what's clean, for what's unclean, and instead heeding to the traditions of men. We have the same thing today. Replacement theology, a false theology that the law is only for the Jews, dispensationalism theology, and other ideas of men that have no basis whatsoever in the Word of Yahweh. They're theories and commandments and doctrines of men. And they might quote some verses to justify their position, but so do the Pharisees and scribes do that. The leaders of Judaism justified themselves and kept their people in fear of straying away from their words. And here's the verses they would quote to justify the people listening to them. In Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 8, it says, "If a matter arises which is too hard for you to judge, between degrees of guilt for bloodshed, between one judgment or another, or between one punishment or another, matters of controversy within your gates. Then you shall arise and go up to the place which Yahweh your Elohim chooses, and you shall come to the priests, the Levites, and to the judge there in those days, and inquire of them. They shall pronounce upon you the sentence of judgment. You know, the rabbis have basically hijacked the position of the Levite. A rabbi is not necessarily a Levite. You shall do according to the sentence which they pronounce upon you in that place which Yahweh chooses, and you shall be careful to do according to all that they order you. According to the sentence of the law in which they instruct you, according to the judgment which they tell you, you shall do. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left from the sentence which they pronounce upon you. Now to the man who acts presumptuously and will not heed the priest who stands to minister there before Yahweh your Elohim, or the judge, that man shall die. So you shall put away the evil from Israel, and all the people shall hear and fear, and no longer act presumptuously. You know, this almost sounds convincing, that you need to listen to the rabbis, to the guys who were there in that place Yahweh chose in Jerusalem, their sentences, their ideas, their thoughts, their interpretations. It almost sounds like we should be listening to them based on what we read here. You know, the Catholics, they do the same thing. In Catholicism, here's their proof text that you need to listen to them. Matthew 16:17. Yahshua answered and said to him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my assembly, my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. These are the verses that the two major religions, Judaism and Catholicism, use to say, you need to listen to us. Catholicism says, well, Peter was our first pope. The line of succession has not been broken since that time. You need to listen to what we say. We have the power to bind and to loose. Therefore, if we change the Sabbath from the seventh day of the week to the first day of the week, we have loosed and we have bound, and what we say must go. That's their mentality. And so we have two major religions that justify their traditions of men by putting themselves in the place of Elohim, and they think they have their proof texts to justify what they're doing. But it was never, ever, ever Yahweh's intent that anybody could dare think they have the power to add to or to take away from Yahweh's words, or to supplant them with their own words. No human being on the planet has the authority to override Yahweh's word and change it. We are not Yahweh's boss. He's not subject to our words. We don't have the authority to change his words or alter his words. And what man has done is take his position as judge, which is a position that entails a deep study of the words of Yahweh and being a minister in delivering his word and his judgment to the people. They have taken that position and they have corrupted it into a position that overthrows Yahweh's words and establishes their own rules, which are contrary to and additions to Yahweh's words. That was never Yahweh's intent. There isn't a human being on the planet that has the authority to do that. The judges themselves are supposed to be held to the standard of Yahweh's word. They have no right to change the very words they are supposed to be using to determine what's right and what's wrong. Judges are not to legislate from the bench, right? They're to take existing legislation and ordinances and apply those things to different cases that come before them. And so what we have in both Judaism and Catholicism are two religions whose judges chose to legislate from the bench and invent their own legislation, their own laws and ordinances that are contrary to the statutes of Yahweh. And they've taken these verses which give men the authority to decide cases and twisted them in such a way that their words would be overriding Yahweh's words. And it was this practice Yahshua is condemning in the book of Mark. Let's take a look again. Pharisees and scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands?" He answered and said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." And so, laying aside the commandment of Elohim, you hold the traditions of men, the washing of pitchers and cups and many other such things you do. He said to them, "All too well you reject the commandment of Elohim, that you may keep your tradition." And so the worship of Yahweh was all in vain, because their judges are legislating from the bench, they're adhering to standards that Yahweh never created, and they're calling things unclean that were never unclean according to the words of Yahweh. They had their own set of rules, they had their own standard. It was highly restrictive, highly burdening, and Yahshua said about them, "Woe to you Pharisees! You love the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces. Woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You're like graves, which are not seen, and the men who walk over them are not aware of them." Then one of the lawyers answered and said to him, "Teacher, by saying these things you reproach us also." He said, "Woe to you also, lawyers! For you load men with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers." So Yahshua is very sharp in his rebuke toward the men who were doing these things. This false standard of clean and unclean caused many, many, many problems in Israel. And many problems, we see it in the New Testament. And understanding this will help us to understand why clean and unclean was such a big issue in the first century. And a lot of the scriptures which are talking about something being unclean or not being unclean in the New Testament in a fashion that would seem to dismiss it are actually attacks on the standard by mainstream Judaism, not the standards found in Yahweh's word. And so we read this again. As he spoke, a certain Pharisee asked him to dine with him, so he went in, he sat down to eat. The Pharisee saw it, he marveled he had not first washed before dinner. The master said to him, "Now you Pharisees, you make the outside of the cup and dish clean, but your inward part is full of greed and wickedness. Foolish ones, did not he who made the outside make the inside also? But rather give alms of such things as you have, and then indeed all things are clean to you." What is it about giving alms that makes this food they're eating clean? If we're looking at this verse from the wrong perspective, we might assume that we can eat all the pork we want. This has nothing to do with eating pork. He said, "They appeared clean on the outside, but on the inside they were full of greed and wickedness." That's what was within them. Greed. They wanted more and more and more and more. And now being greedy would be the opposite of what? Giving alms. Right? If I'm greedy, I'm not going to give alms. If I do give alms, then that would be a sign I'm not being greedy. But the Pharisees, because they were greedy, they were not giving alms. And because they were focused on the outward, they invented these laws and traditions which ensured the washing of hands so that they might appear to be clean on the outside, and as well also appear unto men that they're extra careful about keeping themselves from the unclean things. But what if they instead had their focus on meeting the needs of others rather than meeting their own needs? And rather than being greedy, they chose to give of themselves. They would be less focused on blessing themselves, serving themselves, exalting themselves, and more focused on meeting the needs of other people. You know, we actually see this kind of thing in modern groups of people who claim to be believers. Get together, they want to live a set-apart lifestyle, away from the world, away from its corruptions, away from the uncleanness and defilements of the world. They all get together and decide they're going to be so special and so set apart. Start looking around them, and everybody else in the world they're less holy than me. They're less set apart than I am. They're more defiled than I am. And so they have their own little club where they all see each other as super special chosen ones. Maybe even start a commune where they all live together in this man-made utopia where there's no outside influence, and it becomes self-focused, not others-focused. They become Pharisees, not giving, not gathering to the point for the purposes of giving. They forget we're supposed to be out feeding the poor, caring for the sick, visiting those in prison, and blessing the uninformed with the light of Yahweh's ways. Instead, all their energies are devoted toward keeping this monstrosity of an organization going, and gloating in a false sense of self-righteousness because they're not like the other men. They're holier than those other men because of how set apart they are from the world, but Yahweh didn't make us to do that. He calls us to not be of the world, but we are to be in the world. And if all the holy men on the earth all got together in little pockets and built their own little miniature cities, their miniature villages, then what happens is everyone gets self-focused. And all the energies is being devoted toward maintaining the group rather than going out. And that's why communes fail. That's why they fail. Because everyone gets self-focused, and Yahweh won't let it survive. He won't. And I know a lot of people who love the idea. I love the idea. Having our own little village somewhere. Get 1,000 acres or something. Everybody just kind of move that one village, and you have one part of land, I've got another, and we have our own little kingdom of Yahweh on the earth right there. Everyone I've ever known who's tried to do that, every single one of them have failed. Because this is not Yahweh's plan right now. Maybe someday in the future, but I don't see it being his plan. Why? Because we need to be in the world in order to reach the world. If we all go in our own little pockets, if there's a brother in California, a brother in Canada, a brother in Washington, a brother in Florida, a brother in Missouri, we all go to Oklahoma and build some big commune. That's one less brother in Canada, one less brother in California, one less brother in Florida, one less brother in Missouri, who can reach out to their friends and neighbors and people that are around them and share with them the awesome works of Yahweh. And where are they? They all go in one little zone, build their little Pharisaical commune, and pat themselves on the back as they grow in their self-righteousness, thinking they are superior to others when they've missed the point entirely. Yahshua, he went out among the people. There were times they withdrew. There were times they withdrew. They went by themselves. They strengthened themselves through prayer, through the word, through fellowship, and then they would go out again. Now, if there was a group somewhere that was their mentality, I don't know. It may succeed. I don't know. We have a real problem with authority in the body of Messiah today. And anyway, I'm just sharing how we can fall into these same trappings. I don't know how many believers I've talked to. Probably hundreds, maybe thousands, who say, oh boy, it'd just be wonderful to have our own little place. One brother could be, working with leather. Another one could be raising sheep. Another one could be growing crops, and we'd all have our own little government within a government. And that's that passion we have for a righteous city is a Yahweh-given passion. But we need to channel that passion toward making the cities that we live in now righteous cities. And that takes one soul at a time, one person at a time. And so this is what I'm pointing this out, because I kind of feel like it became, as the Pharisees became sectarian, we are the holy ones, we are the righteous ones, and people who are outside our group are not. If you want to be like us, you got to act like us. You got to do the things that we do. This whole mentality and becoming self-focused rather than others-focused was a real detriment. It was a real problem. And so if the Pharisees, instead of being self-focused, they were others-focused. And we're all about trying to serve, trying to bless the needs of the downtrodden, of the weak, of the sick, providing alms. The word alms means mercy, toward those who are in need. I'm not just talking about monetary almsgiving, but giving of time, giving of energy, giving of resources to help and to bless others. If they were others-focused rather than self-focused, they would have never felt the need to come up with these extra biblical laws to separate themselves from others in order to appear more righteous. And so if they were almsgivers and had the mindset of blessing and serving, they would not have been so self-absorbed to the extent of believing a little dirt on their hands keeps them from eating a piece of food. And this was a real problem in the first century. And that's why Yahshua says, you focus on others, and all these things that you think are unclean, it's not in the word of Yahweh. All these things will be clean, because everything you're doing is to please yourself. It's not to please Yahweh. It's to please yourself. And if you become others-focused rather than trying to please yourself, then all these things that you think are unclean, you're going to find they're really not. And you'll walk away from the commandments of men, and you'll walk toward the commandments of Elohim. That's the gist of what he's saying. If he was saying, oh, now you can eat all the pork you want as long as you give money to the poor, then he would have been a false teacher in Israel. They would have stoned him on the spot. So it's not what he was saying. And we see this also later spoken by Paul to Brother Titus. It says, for there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, whose mouths must be stopped, who subvert whole households, teaching things which they ought not for the sake of dishonest gain. See, they were greedy. Same thing. Dishonest gain. They want more and more. One of them, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. This testimony is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply, just like Yahshua did. He rebuked them sharply, didn't he? He didn't mince words. That they may be sound in faith, not giving heed to Jewish fables and commandments of men who turn from the truth. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. Nothing. Even their mind, their conscience are defiled. They profess to know Elohim, but in works they deny him, being abominable, disobedient, and disqualified for every good work. What's he saying here? To the pure, all things are pure. Take it out of context. He might even say a pile of vomit's pure. Or, a rotting corpse. Oh, it's pure because all things are pure to me because I'm pure. No, that's not what he's saying. What's he saying here? I mean, there are things that are not pure. 1 Timothy 5:22, he says to Timothy, do not lay hands on anyone hastily. Do not share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. Well, if there was nothing that was impure, then why is he admonishing Timothy here to keep himself pure? Or Philippians 4:8, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are good report, if there is any virtue, if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. You mean to say there might be things which are not pure? Otherwise, he wouldn't have admonished to focus on the pure. So if things are already pure because you're pure, why would it even be mentioned that we need to focus on pure things? And so we can't say that Paul is setting aside what Yahweh calls impure. No, he's admonishing here in Philippians and in 1 Timothy, stay away from impure things. So there are things that are impure. So what is he saying in 1 Timothy? He's doing the same thing Yahshua did when talking to the Pharisee at dinner that day. He's upbraiding the elements of first century Judaism and casting them down and saying, this is not right. The things which glorify the commandments of men and giving heed to Jewish stories and fables while laying aside the commandments of Elohim. He said they profess to know Elohim, but in works they deny him. And they're giving heed to the commandments of men. And so he is saying just what Yahshua said. That because they are not men who give alms, because they are greedy, then and their minds and their consciences are defiled. The things which are not even impure, the things that are not even dirty, the things that are not even impure, those things to them are dirty because their minds are not pure. And so to the defiled and the unbelieving, nothing's pure. Nothing. Because they're greedy and because that's the condition of their heart. And so it's no different than what Yahshua was telling the scribes and Pharisees. He was not correcting them for obeying Yahweh's laws. He was correcting, that would be preposterous. I mean, he would have been rejected for teaching falsehood. He was correcting them for how they, out of their impure minds, would set aside Yahweh's laws. And calling things unclean that were not really unclean to begin with. And just as Yahshua taught the Pharisees that if they would get their mind out of the gutter of gluttony and man-centered wickedness and man-centered religions and commandments of men, instead focus on Yahweh and his commandments to give of themselves, to give alms, to love their neighbor, they wouldn't be declaring things which are clean to be unclean. And they would submit themselves to the ordinances and statutes of Yahweh rather than the statutes and ordinances of men. To the pure, all things are pure. There are other ways of looking at this too, in a spiritual sense. Have you ever noticed that someone who has bitterness in their heart, they often will find evil where there's no evil? I've seen it many times where one person's bitter at another person because they find fault with them. They're defiled by bitterness. It says by, the root of bitterness, many become defiled. They're defiled by bitterness, and therefore, brother number one will assume brother number two is doing wrong when he's really doing nothing at all. That's even wrong, as I shared a few weeks ago. And so because they view this other person as being evil, everything that person does is considered to be evil, even when no evil exists. Why? Because their mind is defiled by the root of bitterness. And they can't make a righteous judgment because their mind is defiled. Therefore, this is it says here, because they're defiled, nothing's pure. Nothing that other person does could be pure. And there are some people who are this way toward Christianity. And when I say that, I qualify it as being mainstream churches type of Christianity. And because they are bitter at the modern churches today, they can't see anything they would do could ever possibly be correct. Because they're mad. This is what happens. Now, I'll give you a little heads up here. If you're new to this walk, and you try to share this with your friends at your church, you share this with your pastor, you share this with your relatives, most of the time, they're going to reject what you say. Most of the time. Might be a few who grab onto it. But what happens is, because those people begin to reject you and may harm you, may hurt you, may call you names, may separate you from their company, may kick you out of their congregation, it opens the potential doorway for a person who is of the walk that we understand today, for instance, that we don't eat pork, we don't eat unclean things, to become bitter toward the church, toward all churches, toward all Christians. And out of that bitterness, which defiles their heart, begin to treat people who are in mainstream churches as outcasts, as unbelievers, as people who are wicked, and they'll mock them, they'll make fun of them, they'll mistreat them, but it's all rooted in pride and bitterness and hurt. These people may have really, really hurt you. The people in the church, maybe that you've shared with, some of you listening, I'm sure, have been very hurt by people who are in the mainstream Sunday churches, and because of that, you may feel a pull, not by Yahweh's Spirit, but by the enemy, to hate and to grow bitter toward them and become defiled in your heart to the extent that just because a Christian taught it can't possibly be correct, just because some Sunday churchgoer taught it, it must be wrong. Well, the reality is a lot of what they teach is good. Some things they teach I don't believe is right. But we have to have fair and wise and discerning judgment to be able to glean, to be able to say, okay, well, this part here is correct, this part here doesn't appear to be correct to me based on what I see over here, and make a wise discernment and not reject them, not mistreat them, not grow bitter at them. I have seen entire ministries, entire websites that are built, obviously, on bitterness. They're going to show those Sunday churchgoers how wrong they are, and they're just going to rip into them. And so this is what I'm talking about. As I share with you about the trappings that the Pharisees were caught up in, I want to keep in mind my own potential to fall into the same trappings, and also share with you some of my meditations of how I've seen people in this walk fall into these trappings, where they can't effectively minister to a Christian, nominal Christian, everyday Sunday-going Christian, because they're so busy condemning them. And by that condemnation, by that harmful, hurtful spirit, they become stumbling blocks toward those Christians being able to accept the things that we share. And this is a major problem among us as Torah observant believers. And so the Pharisees, they were seeing so many things as being unclean and being wrong and being dirty. In reality, there was nothing unclean or wrong or dirty there, because their minds and consciences were defiled. We can fall into that same trap. And it's no wonder some of us, they would think are Pharisees, because we're operating in the same realm if we allow our hearts to become bitter toward outsiders, toward those who we think are outsiders. And they're really not outsiders. A lot of them might not be. So these unclean things that were in their hearts was defiling themselves in their ability to judge. And that was a spiritual root of why they were doing the things they were doing. They had pride, they had greed, all kinds of sins stored up. The sin had grown and matured into this monstrosity of the sect of the Pharisees. And so their hearts were defiled, and they could not recognize biblical purity where it existed. They were calling good evil and evil good. And Yahweh doesn't like that. He says in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light, light for darkness, bitter for sweet, sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight." We cannot grow bitter toward those who may mistreat us, who don't see the same things we do regarding Torah, regarding His name and these things. We cannot grow bitter. Otherwise, we start calling people who are truly trying to do the right thing, and their hearts are sincere and Yahweh accepts them, we're calling them evil. When Yahweh calls them good, He accepts them right where they're at. And we assume they're in darkness when they're walking in the light that they're given. And we are bitter, and they are sweet in His eyes. Why? Because they're doing the best they know. But we've got bitterness in us because they're not doing what we say. Do we see this? I'm not trying to condemn even anybody who may have this. But it's a trapping. It's a snare from the devil. The devil is trying to attack us and cause us to trip up in this area. And it's because we're wise in our own eyes and prudent in our own sight. And we don't want to do this with the wisdom Yahweh blesses us with. We don't want to become wise in our own eyes. We want to be thankful for the wisdom He gives us and stay humble. Because He who justifies the wicked and He who condemns the just, both of them alike are an abomination to Yahweh. We don't want to be an abomination to Yahweh. We are trying to avoid the abominable things. We're trying to avoid becoming abominable in His sight. We want to have righteous judgment based on truth, based on a pure mind, based on an undefiled conscience, based on love and not hate, kindness and not unkindness. May Yahweh give us right discernment between the clean and the unclean. We don't want to become unclean through not which enters the mouth, but through what might be growing and taking root in our hearts. Either way, we can become defiled. And so may Yahweh give us right discernment between the holy and the unholy, between what is good and what is evil, between light and darkness, between what's sweet and what's just bitterness, between what's the wisdom of Yahweh and what's the failed wisdom of men, between what's justifiable and what's worthy of condemnation. And just as Yahshua told the Pharisees and Paul had told Timothy, it all starts with the condition of our hearts. Are we fully yielded to the word of Yahweh, or are we busy making our own rules? Are we seeing the actions of others correctly? Or are our hearts just not cleansed yet from bitternesses and uncleannesses because we haven't fully surrendered ourselves to the will of Elohim? And these are deep things. These are deep things. As we study clean and unclean, I'm not going to let myself off the hook. If I've got some uncleanness in my heart, I'm not just going to talk about uncleanness that might be entering our mouths, but uncleanness that might be within each of us in areas where it should not exist. Spiritually, physically, we are called to Yahweh's standard of what is clean. That's what we are called to. I look forward to sharing more in the weeks ahead, and brothers and sisters, may Yahweh give us all discerning hearts to understand, so that our will and our ways are fully in line with His will and His ways, because His ways are true and righteous and holy and clean and pure. Let's seek to walk in what is just, what is holy, what is true, what is right, what is pure, and what is clean, that we might be a manifestation of Yahshua HaMashiach in all elements, in all that we do, and all that we think. May Yahweh bless you, and may Yahweh have mercy on us all.